Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Indigenous Literatures, Social Justice, and the Decolonial Library, which is sponsored by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'll just point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you perhaps will see a Q&A panel or a chat panel. If you don't, you can click the button with the little dialog cloud and the button labeled Q&A at the bottom of your screen to activate the panels. If you don't see the Q&A, it may be under the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions to our speakers. At the end of the presentation, Daniel will be happy to take a few minutes to answer your questions, so please do send your questions in throughout. If you experience any technical issues, that's what the chat's for. Please send me a message and I'll troubleshoot the issue with you privately. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars, so please feel free to tweet at us during the event. And also note that we're recording today's program and that everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version of the presentation. And with that, I will just mention that our speaker today is Daniel Heath Justice, and we'll turn the floor over to him.
Thank you very much. So I just want to revisit our instructions. This is what I'm doing, right?
Yep. There we go.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Technology is not typically my strong suit, but I'm very grateful to Mark for the assistance here. So yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you, and I really want to thank Choice and Wilfrid Laurier University Press for this opportunity. Again, this is my first webinar, and I look forward to seeing where our conversation goes. So I do have some thank yous. In particular, I want to thank the Musqueam Nation on whose land I have the very great honor of doing work in the First Nations and Indigenous Studies program at the University of British Columbia. Musqueam has always been incredibly supportive of the work that we do, and I felt very nourished and nurtured by the relationships we've had here. So in Musqueam territory and along the coast, we hold our hands up in gratitude, and I hold my hands up in deep gratitude to Musqueam. Claire Hitchens and Marion Toledo Candelaria and the whole Wilfrid Laurier University crew has been amazing, not only for the book that a lot of this stuff emerges from, but also just in terms of support. So thank you there. And I wanted to mention a few folks who I've had the real privilege of working with who've also helped to shape some of my ideas around this. Kim Lawson and Sarah DuPont here at Huehua Library. And I'll talk more about Huehua Library, but Kim in particular has been an extraordinary colleague and a library scientist specialist in particular with Indigenous librarianship. And I really want to recognize her. And again, I'll be talking a little bit about Huehua toward the end of the presentation. But amazing colleagues, but also very thoughtful scholars in thinking about how librarianship and Indigenous knowledge either go together or sometimes where they don't. And for those of you who don't know Debbie Reese, Nambe Pueblo scholar and the creator of the American Indians in Children's Literature blog, I highly, highly recommend that you not only check out her blog, but also follow her on Twitter. Debbie does incredible work. She's a formidable intellectual force, but also a very, very generous person and a very generous scholar. And her work is primarily on representations of American Indians in children's literature, but she also looked at the wider range of representations and also the impacts that representations have on Indigenous youth, and also Indigenous communities in general. And a lot of the conversations I've had with Debbie have also informed some of my thinking about what we'll be talking about today. So today's discussion, I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction about where I come from on this large topic, and then move right into some of the kind of intellectual foundations that I'm interested in addressing, and also the contexts of libraries and Indigenous literature, or Indigenous literatures plural, thinking about the challenges and possibilities of decolonizing the library, especially in terms of academic libraries, but a wide range of library contexts. And thinking about the key question, what might a decolonial library look like for Indigenous literatures in particular? And kind of leaving that as a wide open question. So in terms of an introduction, I am a Cherokee Nation citizen. I was born and raised outside of community in a little town in Colorado. I am currently a professor in the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies at UBC. I'm also cross-affiliated with the Department of English. And my focus has always been on Indigenous literatures, Indigenous stories, and Indigenous literary histories. So I come to this not as a scholar of library sciences, but as a longtime lover of libraries, as a bookworm, and as somebody who, being raised outside of community, went to books to know the world, and in a lot of ways went to other people's stories to know what my story was. And I've experienced both the real benefits of that, but also the deforming results of taking on other people's stories. Had I not gone into literature, however, I probably would have been a librarian, although certainly my idea of the kind of librarian I wanted to be wasn't necessarily the most realistic. I certainly had a role model, and there weren't very many vampires to slay, so I decided to take on settler colonialism, which I think was probably a better way of doing it. Although I do definitely envy Giles's tweed. So this gives. I've always loved libraries. I've always been powerfully influenced by libraries, both in good ways and not, some not so good ways. So I wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to the libraries that have been particularly formative to me. So the first one on the left-hand side is the Victor Public Library, which is the first library I ever went to as a child in my little town of 250 when I was growing up in Colorado, the mountains of Colorado. The Franklin Ferguson Memorial Library on the right is the library that was for the larger community about 6 miles away, but also where our school library was located. And I was a library aide through junior and senior high there. And then the bottom image is the James A. Michener Library at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, Colorado, where I was an undergraduate. And that was, I still remember when I walked into that building and I saw all of those books. And this is back in the day when we had card catalogs. It was such an amazing thing to see this repository of knowledge, because I came from a very small town. I didn't have a lot of family members who'd gone to university. So this was a very powerful, symbolic space. But it was also a symbolic space where there was so much of me that I didn't feel belonged. And that's a little bit of what I want to talk about today. So one of the things, we hear a lot of things if you're an Indigenous Lit scholar, a lot of presumptions that people have when they just hear the connection of Indigenous with literature. So a few of those things are, I didn't know they had a literature, which I always find quite obnoxious. Oh, you mean like myths and legends, right? And then this presumption that Indigenous peoples have only been creating literatures in the last 50, 100 years, and only in colonial languages. And then this one was really interesting because this came from a non-Indigenous scholar who teaches Aboriginal literatures in Australia, and her dean expressed to her one day that Aboriginal people won't have a literature until they have a Shakespeare, and there are so many things to unpack there. But I think it just gives a little bit of a sense of the ways in which indigeneity and literary production are often seen at odds, which makes for very challenging relationships when we are talking about libraries and when we're talking about academic libraries. So often that is rooted in an idea of deficit, that Indigenous peoples are somehow deficient in our cultural productions, our intellectual knowledge, our creative capacity. Eve Tuck, who's an Indigenous scholar at the University of Toronto, has done a beautiful and really, really important essay called Suspending Damage, and I highly recommend this as a corrective to some of the deficit thinking about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous ways. So I'm not going to read everything word for word on the slides. I just want to kind of hit the high points because I do want to make sure that we have some time for conversation. But so why does this matter? I think one of the reasons it matters is because who does or does not possess literature and who does or does not have knowledge worth attending to is always political. And it's always deeply embedded in often very inequitable power relationships. And it's reinforced through education and through the structures that are around the distribution of education. And education becomes weaponized against certain groups to the benefit of others. So often, I think we, as a larger society, we ignore these histories, not just of the fact that other people, you know, a wide range, all peoples have literatures, all peoples have stories that are worth attending to, but also there is a kind of amnesia around the erasure of a lot of these literatures, an erasure of a lot of the mechanisms by which these literatures are and have historically been expressed. And so when we have histories of destruction and we don't interrogate those histories, then the absence that results from that destruction, or the perceived absence, is something that becomes normalized to a lot of people. And unfortunately, it becomes normalized to a lot of Indigenous peoples as well. I was a fourth-year undergraduate before I had any idea that Indigenous writers produced a body of significant work, because I had internalized the idea that the only real literature came from Europe. And that was a very long process of disentanglement and a lot of self-shame that I had to work with. And I also see that a lot with my own students, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, because I think these issues are deformative to all of us, but have a particularly corrosive impact on Indigenous peoples. So I thought we might attend to some terminology that might be useful. One of these terms is, thinking about what do we mean by literature? And I think what Indigenous scholars and Indigenous writers and thinkers are talking about as literature is not always what non-Indigenous people are thinking about with literature. Because so often there's a distinction between what we see as a writing skill and the more elevated communicative forms that have cultural capital, which would be literature. Thus, we have popular writing and literary fiction, which, all of those distinctions certainly break down as they are interrogated more. And I think we can see that a lot of the works we see today as high art were very popular fiction and popular works of their own time. And so I think we always have to interrogate the basic foundations of what we mean by the literary. And also think about who those definitions benefit. Well, they certainly benefit certain groups that have had the power to enforce their definitions at the expense of others. And I think we also presume that there's a necessary binary or an evolutionary relationship between oral literatures or oral traditions and orature versus literature. And I think certainly when we're talking about Indigenous story traditions, we see that these are often in play together all the time, that there is an ongoing and mutually constitutive relationship between them, that there isn't this evolutionary model where the oral, everybody starts with the oral and then evolves up to the literary, which is more sophisticated. In so many cases, the oral is far more challenging for non-specialists than the written might be. So I think we also have to interrogate that. And I think we also have to think about the that there's a range of ways in which literatures have been expressed historically and are still expressed today. So we would talk not only about the book as codex, but also other forms of inscribed text. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And also transmission practices, that there are a lot of different protocols around how we share stories and in which way, and who has the authority, who has the responsibility for certain stories. And also thinking about preservation protocols. I mean, libraries are often seen as, at least kind of more broadly, they're seen as places where knowledge is preserved. And I know in library sciences that's a very complicated and that too is an interrogated concept. But I'm also thinking more broadly that libraries carry so much more symbolic weight for the culture at large, and even people who don't necessarily patronize libraries have deeply felt opinions about what a library is or should be. So I just wanted to put up a few ideas about what writing is, visual code. So a few different scholars, I think Penelope Kelsey's idea of visual code is an important one, because again, it kind of detangles the cultural capital idea from how texts are communicated, and also kind of undermines some of the authority that certain textual forms have as opposed to others. And thinking about, we're not just talking about alphabetic texts, we're not just talking about hieroglyphic or syllabic texts, and we're not talking about libraries only as shelves with bound codices on them. So often, more broadly, the library is the preservation structure of European monastic traditions. And while we know that today's libraries are much more dynamic and diverse spaces, I think even now there's still an idea, especially in academic spaces, that the library serves a particular kind of symbolic function that harkens back to the monastic traditions. And then we also have, when we're thinking about those monastic traditions, I think we also have to think about the narratives around those, that the Christian monks saved knowledge from the savage barbarian hordes. And we know that that's partly true, and we know that's partly false, and we also know it's far more complicated historically than that. We know that a lot of the monks who worked in the scriptoria were illiterate. So I think as we're interrogating certain concepts, we also have to bring that critical lens to what we think of as a library. And also keep in mind that indigenous peoples have always produced stories, have always produced literatures, and have always been present not just as authors, but as creative producers as well. So again, why does this matter? I think partly it matters for accuracy. Lots of conversation these days about the value, the importance and the siege condition of truth and facts. Well, this is an issue of accuracy. We have always been literate peoples in both inscribed forms and in oral traditions. And since 1492, many, many, many indigenous peoples have been very fluent in our own literary forms as well as those of colonizers. I think it matters because there are arguments about cultural capital that we have to bring to the forefront and we have to make explicit, because the implicit understandings don't serve a wide range of communities, especially those who are marginalized. There's also an idea of cultural chauvinism that's behind a lot of ideas when we talk about literature, because literature is so often marked as so-called civilized, whereas those who are seen as not having literature are somehow less civilized or even less human than those with a so-called sophisticated literature. But what we're actually talking about is that that these are settler-colonial agents rarely took the time to become literate in indigenous traditions, but presumed that literacy went in a singular direction. And I think we have to put that at the forefront as well, that we're not talking about indigenous illiteracy. We're actually in many cases talking about settler-colonial illiteracy. And I think deficit thinking hurts everybody, but it's particularly harmful to indigenous people from our youth to our university students to our elders. I think deficit thinking serves no one well because deficit thinking is a lie. It doesn't mean that indigenous communities don't have substantial concerns, and every community has various issues that it's dealing with, but those are rooted within the experience of settler colonialism. They are not an innate expression of who indigenous peoples are. So I think it's good when we're talking about libraries to remind ourselves of the fact that there were many, many libraries. There still are, but there were many libraries here when Europeans first arrived, and many of those were destroyed intentionally. I like this quotation from Mark Kurlansky where he talks about Hernan Cortés, who was amazed by not only the architecture of the Triple Alliance, known today as Aztecs, but also with their intellectual accomplishments, with their papermaking, with their books. That, for him, was a marker that they were profoundly civilized. It took very little time, once there was resistance to Spanish invasion, to pull away from the admiration. Within 20 years, Cortés destroyed as much of the evidence of Aztec civilization and literary production as he could. So again, it was a campaign that specifically targeted indigenous writing, indigenous literary expression, and indigenous literary production. And this is a really powerful quotation. And this came from, and I have more quotations from Craig Womack's Red on Red, but he quotes this in there. How do we mourn for such a loss? We could not stop the fires. They took generations of our hearts and minds, the books, and they threw them into the fires, and we could not save them. So again, it's not that the Mayan people did not have books. It's not that they did not have literatures. It's that those literatures were intentionally targeted for destruction. And of the thousands that were gathered and destroyed, today, at least these are the last numbers I saw, is that we functionally have 3 and just a bit of a 4th one. And all of those were taken as trophies and are in European libraries or archives. That's not the only time it happened, and it still happens today. And that's also an important thing, that it's not just, when we're talking about the destruction of indigenous knowledge, we still have that operating in a lot of different ways. But it's not just about the destruction of the products themselves, but also in the erosion of the protocols and the practices and the traditions of literacy within those forms. That we may still have some of the material objects, but in so many cases, the interpretive traditions have been eroded partly because of language loss and sometimes because of missionization and the vilification of the traditions that went into the production of these forms, and sometimes just because folks are focused on other things because of various community needs. So when we're talking about the destruction of indigenous literatures, we're not just talking about past tense. We also have to continue to think about literature in a broad sense and the many different forms that it takes. And this is a quotation from Craig Womack, that this was an illiteracy campaign by the Spanish, and this is an illiteracy campaign that continues, sponsored by the group claiming to be the most literate. So destroy one literary form so that a singular form stands tall. And then again, Womack talks about that this continues, where we are constantly told that indigenous literature isn't possible, or that it's somehow novel, or it's somehow exceptional, when actually it has always been part of who we are and where we're from. So again, why does this matter? Internalizing these ideas is corrosive. And it lets a lot of larger structures off the hook. And it embeds a lot of the responsibility for things in Indigenous communities that aren't ours. And this is where in Canada a lot of the discussion around truth and reconciliation really centers, where it should be centering anyway, in terms of the idea of the truth part, not just reconciling, but also acknowledging the truth that we are a part of and the histories of assault, not just on bodies, but on minds and legacies. So when I'm talking about Indigenous literatures, I'm not only talking about codex-style books. I'm talking about a wide range of literary forms. And I'm just going to give a few of the examples here. And since we'll have these available, I would encourage you to look up the various forms that Indigenous literatures have taken. It's important to kind of use as a little bit of a caveat that these aren't we won't necessarily approach all of these technologies as we would a literary text, and in some ways doing so is an act of violence, that we have to understand that there are particular reading and analytical protocols that go with each of these, and that to approach them as we would a fiction novel or a nonfiction alphabetic text might not actually be the best way of approaching them. That there are traditions of interpretation and response that are specific to each of these. And if we're going to be serious about attending to them as a broader form of literature, we also have to understand that how we approach them matters, not just the fact that we are seeing them within that larger context. And it's also important to keep in mind that these continue. These textual traditions are ongoing. They're not just historical. And as much as possible, if we can reinforce the fact that our literatures are multifaceted, multidimensional, and connect us to a past and also to a future. This is part of the exciting reality of Indigenous literature when we're talking about the library, but it's also part of the challenge that the library looks like a very different space when we're thinking of diverse Indigenous literary production. In some cases, they're still very imperiled, and I think it's really important to talk about language and the besieged state of a lot of Indigenous languages. Here in British Columbia, most Indigenous languages are critically endangered. And in Cherokee Nation, a lot of folks are working very hard to maintain and to build language capacity. I've started learning, in my 40s, and it's a challenge, but it's an important one, and it's a vital one if we're going to be able to attain a lot of these other literary traditions, and maybe develop some new ones that are more deeply tied to cultural continuity. So, what is common to these discussions? All of these literatures are, each is grounded in cultural values, relations, geographies, and material resources. Every one has been seen as a threat by non-Indigenous authorities, and each one has been the focus of some sort of violence from settler governments, from educators, as well as religious agents. So this is a key point to me. It has never been the case that we haven't had our own literatures or our own writing. It's that settler societies have actively targeted those things and our abilities to use them through various forms of weaponized education and stigma, and libraries are a part of that. But each of these forms has also been a really important site of strength and recovery. And even our work in colonial languages belongs in that resurgence space, that just because something is written in a non-Indigenous language does not mean that it's not ours now as well, and that it can't be a really important site of strength and cultural capacity, that these things don't have to be in positions of antagonism. So I would argue that the library is always an ideological structure. I don't think this is new to some folks, but I think for others it may be. Certainly for my students, this is sometimes eye-opening, but for a lot of them it's not. They know, they've known for all the entirety of their lives and their entirety of their educational experiences. They've always known that the library is a structure that carries with it particular forms of privilege and particular forms of violence, as well as particular forms of liberation. And it's not just what is in a library, but also its organizational logic and whose norms define that. And here I'm of course thinking about Dewey Decimal System, which I find one of the most colonial organizational systems, but the Library of Congress isn't much better. And it's also about who does or does not have access to that knowledge. And access isn't just about who can get into the door, but who has access to the particular protocols and values, and also just the comfort level of feeling like they belong in that space and have the right of access there. And it's important to keep in mind that in a lot of, in every Indigenous tradition I know, not all things are meant for all people at all times, that there are boundaries around knowledge that aren't just about kind of interfering with academic freedom, but are about maintaining the integrity of the knowledge, but also maintaining the safety of the community. And I recognize that we are not in a great time for libraries, and if we have any guests from the UK, I recognize that the library systems there are under a particular level of assault, but it's the case everywhere. Market thinking, austerity, a lack of curiosity, and just blatant anti-intellectualism has meant that we are in a bad time for libraries. And it's the idea of libraries as a social good is no longer something we can just take as a given, but libraries have never only been good. They've always been sites of harm and limited access and exclusion. So I think if we're going to advocate for the value of libraries, academic as well as public, we also need to talk about transforming them, because the old ways are not always the ways that are healthy for the people who need it the most. So one of the things that I find fascinating, and again, this partly comes from conversations with my colleagues at Huihua Library, is the idea of the classification system and the taxonomies that we use. And taxonomies humans are categorizing creatures, but I think especially the Enlightenment was not just about driving away the darkness of ignorance. It was about imperial expansion worldwide and taking resources and cultural productions of people from all over the world and classifying, claiming, defining, co-opting, and redefining those. And the idea of classification is often one of mastery. And I think we have to acknowledge the problems of the mastery rhetoric. And in so many of these classification systems, Indigenous knowledge is accorded a lower status of folklore, myth, and legend. And of course, folklore scholars will bristle at that, and I don't see these as lower capital or as inevitably problematic terms, but so often the ways that they have been used, especially in collections classification, has been very, very problematic and very damaging, where if I go to look at Cherokee traditions on the bookshelf, often it'll be under folklore, whereas it won't be considered one of, in world religions, or it won't be considered under philosophy. So I think we have to think about what that communicates to a young Cherokee reader who is encountering high cultural capital as exclusively Euro-Western and low cultural capital as their own inheritance. Salvage ethnography, the tradition there the archive is not just a repository of willingly granted materials. Often it's a space of looting. It's the place where a lot of stolen knowledge has been maintained, and often to the exclusion of the people from whom that knowledge was stolen. So I think we also have to think about the library not just as a space of benevolent knowledge sharing, but also maintenance of a particular kind of power structure that prevents certain people from having access to the materials that are their inheritance. And I think a key point for me here is that taxonomies define the limits of what is possible, but also what is considered impossible. And if you change the taxonomy, you change the definition of what is possible. So yeah, libraries have always been part of settler colonialism. And I believe that they can be part of the solutions. So what are some other possibilities? From my learning, but also thinking about as a literary scholar, thinking about knowledge stewardship has to attend to three things. Content, whose knowledge is included. This is why I talk about literature in the plural. That we're not only talking about a singular model of knowledge, but we're thinking about a wider array of possibilities. We're thinking about how these things are classified, how they're put on the shelf, how they're put together, and whose knowledge gets centered in that, or whose protocols and traditions are valued in the development of this classification system. And also thinking about the audience. Are Indigenous peoples and other marginalized peoples part of the protocols and processes that make this knowledge meaningful? And maybe that means that some of this knowledge is available to everybody, and sometimes that might mean there are limits, that only people who are empowered by the community have access to certain things. These are conversations, and every community and every context is going to be different. So thinking about why this might matter to academic libraries, in a time where the value of the work that is done is besieged, we have to think about expanding the relevance of these materials to a wide range of communities, and also acknowledging the different histories and different histories of experience with the library, that we can't just treat libraries as an inevitable good, because not everyone has experienced the good of that. We also have to deepen community commitment and reciprocity. If an academic library isn't doing the outreach, it becomes the ivory tower. And ivory towers are easy targets. They're easy to see and they're easy to go after. But if we think of it as a different kind of space, then that might be something that we can actually grow rather than worry about maintaining. It opens new possibilities for partnership. And it helps to undo some of the damage that libraries have contributed to. It's not just libraries, and certainly I'm not saying that libraries have been the core of this. Libraries are part of a larger weaponized education system that, as a professor, I'm part of as well. We are all implicated in this, and it's our work, it's the work of all of us to undo. So I just wanted to give a bit of a shout out. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for conversation, but here at the University of British Columbia, Huehua Library, I think, is doing some really exceptional things. Huehua is a Squamish word that means echo, and the Huehua Library is attached to the First Nations House of Learning, which is our campus longhouse, and it is unique as far as I know. So this is the website. I highly recommend. Go to it, check it out, read all about it. They also have a number of publications that can tell you more. But it's the only Indigenous branch of an academic library in Canada. It's not the only Indigenous library, but of an academic library. And it has a very different classification and knowledge organization system that is really rooted in British Columbia and in Indigenous communities in this part of the world. That's also based on the Brian Deere classification system from out east here in Canada, from Mohawk country, where the collections themselves center Indigenous knowledge and perspectives and geographic and kinship relations. I don't have time to go into all of it, but again, please go to their website. But the organizational principle is that they put Indigenous communities first in terms of organization, in terms of access, and in terms of relevance. It is, as they describe it, a center for academic and Indigenous community scholarship. So this is a place where scholars from inside and outside the academy can come together, learn, share, and build. So Is a decolonial library possible? If we only are thinking about the Dark Ages bulwark against ignorance, no, I don't think so at all. I think that's actually part of the colonial problem. But I think if we see them as sites of continuity and exchange that are respectful, that are engaged really deeply with local communities, with local contexts, and with the content that is there, and if it's done so in a way that is different from the way it's been done in the past, I think we can approach something like a decolonial library, where we're thinking about the library as an ongoing living community, not even just as a site, but as a community itself, and as a gathering grounds where we are able to do important work that speaks to the past and to the future. Rather than a lifeless monument, I think we can really go into some pretty exceptional places. Because I think it's important for everyone to keep in mind, we are all on Indigenous lands. These libraries belong to Indigenous peoples too. And you won't necessarily know who your Indigenous patrons are. I'm a very light-skinned Cherokee person. A lot of my instructors and a lot of the librarians I worked with did not know I was Indigenous until they met my dad, or until I said something. So you won't necessarily know who all of your Indigenous patrons are. You won't necessarily know who's being excluded or who might want to be included. So keep in mind that these are our inheritances as well, especially because a lot of these libraries hold our cultural knowledge. And oftentimes that came into the library in really problematic ways. I think a decolonial library will center living communities and living artists, bring writers in, make space for not just the established writers, but the emerging writers. And don't imagine that emerging writers are just young people. A lot of our elders are emerging writers as well and have stories to share and can use the support. I think librarians need to understand the legacies of harm and the weaponization of education and the weaponization of libraries, and actively work to heal them. And one of the best ways of doing that is to build relationships with your local communities. And also to support Indigenous librarians. There are so many Indigenous peoples who are in library sciences who can use that support and who deserve that support and who need to be heard and could be centered more in these kinds of conversations. Support them, mentor them, listen to them. And I think committing to ongoing relationships of intellectual reciprocity and actively contesting extractive practices of knowledge collection is vitally important. And just bringing humility, generosity, openness, and a willingness to be adaptive into these relationships. So a few recommended resources as we're wrapping up. The first is from some of the librarians at Huehua Library. Highly recommend it. And I'll pull this up again in just a second. Kim Larson was also part of a project, Protocols for Native American Archival Materials. Debbie Reese's blog, again, please go there, read it, follow her on Twitter. And Philip Round is a non-Indigenous scholar who did a really exceptional book about the histories of the book in Indian country, if you're interested. Very illuminating, not just illuminating in terms of book production, but also the politics around Indigenous readership and writership. So highly recommended. I'll come back to this momentarily during our conversation, but I wanted to just say thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge Wilfrid Laurier University Press published my recent book, which takes up a lot of these issues around Indigenous literary production. But I do want to say Wado, Galihalega, I'm very grateful to you. Thank you for the time that you've taken out of your day to come and chat. These are some ways of contacting me directly. I'm really bad with email. I'm just going to be really honest. There's my email address, but it'll take some time. I'm not on Twitter right now because I'm trying to finish up a book, but I will get back to it. So again, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here. So I guess now I'm going to turn this over to Mark, and we have plenty of time for some conversations. So what do I need to do now, Mark?
Absolutely nothing. I think you can just leave it right there,
Awesome.
and we'll take a few questions. So I would just remind everyone, if you do have questions, the Q&A box is a great place to put them. If you don't see it on your screen, you can click the little 3 dots across the bottom. They should be across the bottom. They might be somewhere else, as you can change your screen. But that will allow you to find that Q&A box. And we already have several questions, so we'll just jump into them. So let me see. We've got.
So I see the one from Holly Snyder. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yes. Let me see. We have quite a few, actually.
Oh, okay. I only see a couple here. Okay. So
yeah, a couple.
Where do I need to go to get that?
You don't need to go anywhere. I'm just gonna set this up. All right. Yeah. So the one from Holly Snyder that came through the chat box there. Holly says, I take your point about the need to disembody writing as the sole means of conveying cultural capital, yet as a librarian, it leaves me with the question of how libraries can capture the fullness of indigenous literatures. Could you comment on this problematic?
Yeah, I think part of it is that there are a lot of ways that libraries can be part of this. I mean, not all literatures are going to be on the bookshelf. I think a lot of literatures are ongoing. I think we're also talking about oral literary forms. So I think you know, every library is on indigenous lands. Every library has indigenous communities in the region, maybe not immediately close by, but certainly more broadly. Libraries can sponsor readings and mentorship workshops, writing workshops, storytelling festivals. There are all kinds of ways libraries can be spaces where indigenous literatures writ large can be brought in and presented and shared with a public. Can also provide, you know, if they have the funding, not all will, but a lot of libraries have visiting writers or writers in residence. Well, think about writing writ broadly. So what if we have a carver who is deeply knowledgeable about carving traditions and the story traditions that are attached to those? What about a writer in residence who's a carver, or a wampum belt weaver, or a basket maker, thinking about how stories are embodied and embedded in a lot of other forms. So I think a lot of this is just about creativity as well, and thinking about the library as a space not just in terms of what can be maintained in the holdings, but also as spaces where knowledge can flow through, and then connect it to what's in the holdings and connect it to what's there, and also to bring in community knowledge holders to assess the holdings themselves, and to give feedback on that. So I think those are just a few thoughts I would have on that.
Great. Yeah, lots of ideas there. That's great. I'll circle around to Allison's question from a bit earlier as well. Allison was curious about whether there were any indigenous libraries in North America and what became of Canada.
I would say absolutely. I mean, they wouldn't have looked like the libraries of Mesoamerica necessarily, but and again, this is where we have to kind of interrogate what we mean by library. I would say in a lot of communities, the community is the library, that the many people in the community hold the knowledge and share it, but also protect, preserve, and transmit it. So if we're thinking about particular spaces, yeah, absolutely, that you would have. I mean, I'm thinking about in terms of Cherokee communities, we have old wampum belt traditions as well. We have, you know, other material forms that were attached to the transmission of law in an oral form, and we still do in some of our traditional ceremonial grounds. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that those traditions didn't necessarily disappear. They aren't necessarily gone, but they're not necessarily open to all people. They won't even necessarily be open to all people in the community. And I think missionization has had a real impact on a lot of communities as well, where that now there are fracture points in communities where certain knowledge is held by certain community members and not others, because we have a lot of examples of when some community members converted, they destroyed a lot of the older expressive forms or persecuted other community members. Now that wasn't always the case. A lot of people who converted also maintained those traditional forms. So we always have to be careful of not vilifying one or the other. But I think it's important to keep in mind that these are ongoing practices and traditions.
Great. I think we'll take this question from S. Parlongo, who says, in academia, we're often guilty of preferencing a particular type of authority as the gold standard for students to reference in their research. How do we start the conversation around opening ourselves up to acknowledging a more diverse array of experts and ways of knowing?
Well, I think part of it is just starting by talking about that problematic and just being really honest. I mean, our students are smart. They get it. And when we start to share with them our own struggles, I think they appreciate that and they respect that. And understanding that it's hard for all of us, whether people are Indigenous or non-Indigenous, whether they're connected to their traditions or not. These are not easy issues because they're complicated contexts that have been developing over centuries. So I think part of it is we just talk about it. And I think we also have to talk about the ethics of knowledge. That it's, in academia, we very much fetishize academic privilege and freedom of expression and freedom of research. And there are good things about that, but we also need to pair that with the responsibilities that come from freedom. And what it means to be an ethical agent in a site that is so deeply embedded in injustice and oppression, and in possibility of doing things better. So I think my recommendation is always just to be very honest and to work at it and to ask questions of people who have done it well, and to reach out to people, especially I think so often we look very far afield, but we have a lot of people locally in our communities who have done this work and have done it really well, and often with very little recognition. And I think they need to be held up and supported. What often happens is that a lot of people start getting really excited about these things, and then they jump on the bandwagon and get a lot of resources to do it, while the people who've been really laboring and setting the ground get displaced. And I think we need to honor the people who've done the heavy lifting and center them and follow their lead, not kind of take it over.
We've got another question here, jumping down to some that are coming in through the Q&A box as well. Matthew asks, can you clarify what you mean specifically, perhaps with an example of where this is happening well and where it's not, about actively contesting extractive practices of knowledge collection?
Well, I think one of the big issues, I mean, these are the appropriation debates, right? But it's also about taking a look at what is in holding. So one issue is in a lot of traditions, there are ways in which certain ceremonial practices they were limited and still are limited to particular community members, that they're not available to all people. But especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, well, even up into the mid-20th century, a lot of anthropologists would go in, gain community members' trust, and then surreptitiously record ceremonial practices, and then write them up or film them, record them, produce something on that, and distribute it widely, which was a gross violation of ethics. I mean, it's an extractive practice. And what has happened since then is that contemporary writers and scholars will draw on those works, not knowing about the context or not paying attention to the context of how those came into the world, and then are taken by surprise when Indigenous communities, especially more traditional ceremonial communities, are upset about the ways in which their knowledge has been miscommunicated, mistreated, often dismembered and repurposed. So I think it's not just about the fact that knowledge is present, but it's how it became present. Because a lot of the ways that especially older knowledge and older stories came into the public sphere, there was a lot of violence and deception attached to that. And I think we need to be attentive to that and to listen when community members are talking about their concerns. Not all community members have those protocols, and not all of the collections were violating cultural values, but in many cases they were, and sometimes still are.
Another question here from Rachel, who asks, do you have any suggestions for librarians helping to collect more literature from the Indigenous perspective?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and this is where I will give a little bit of a plug for the book. The appendix in my book has over 365 Indigenous writers and well over that many works. Indigenous writers from around the globe, from the 1500s all the way to today. So that might be one place to go. Debbie Reese's blog would be a really important place to go. Actually, get on Indigenous Twitter and follow Indigenous writers. You will find so many resources that come up. Chelsea Vowell, who's a Métis scholar and writer here in Canada. Alyssa Elliott, Tuscarora writer. Carly Baker, who's a Métis writer and scholar. All of these folks are constantly putting out really, really great resources. I mean, Indigenous Twitter is the place it's happening. And I'm a bit of a technophobe, and I'm an Indigenous Twitter participant. That's actually where my list came from. I think you'll get a lot of great resources there. And you'll also get a sense of some of the conversations that are happening around those literatures, those writings. But I would also look locally, find out who your writers are. And don't just think about the writers who are published in very kind of conventional forms. Lots of great new writers are producing work in new media. A lot of grassroots filmmakers, lots of guerrilla filmmakers, people doing great stuff in various forms of social media. So think broadly when you're thinking literary production.
We've got so many questions here, and there's no way we have time to get to all of them. I think we'll probably take one or maybe two more. Okay. Let's take this one from Raquel. Do you think there's a conflict or tension between Indigenous perspectives and protocols and rights around knowledge and information and the core library values that are outlined in the Canadian Library Association Statement on Intellectual Freedom and Libraries?
Very possibly. I don't think these conflicts are inevitable, but I think, yeah, you could very often find that to be the case. But one thing I want to push back on is this idea that when Indigenous peoples are talking about accountability and responsibility, that we're saying we're going to shut non-Indigenous people out, or that we're going to stop talking about these things. It's actually about being part of a mutually respectful and reciprocal conversation. I'm a scholar. I believe in the importance of knowledge and sharing knowledge freely. But I also understand why certain knowledge is not shared. And I also understand the important values that go into protecting certain forms of knowledge, not just for the protection of communities, but also for the protection of those who get that knowledge, because there are a lot of ways of misusing it. So I think there is a tension for a lot of folks. And there's not just one Indigenous approach to these issues. There are Indigenous peoples who are much more kind of open about sharing knowledge, and those who are much more closed about sharing it, and certain communities that have much more rigid protocols about sharing, and some that are much more open as well. So I think you will find all positions, but I think it more often than not comes down to respectful, reciprocal conversation.
All right. What do you think, Daniel? Should we take one more? Or
one more. Let's go one more.
All right. Let's go for it. So we've got, again, so many questions. How about this one from Catherine? Regarding Indigenous knowledge and stories being classified as folklore, do you have any advice for maybe a public library that uses the Dewey Decimal System on how to find a more respectful place for these books?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think interrogate what those terms mean. and interrogate what all of the terms mean. And when we're thinking of philosophy, if we're only thinking about pale guys with curly white hair in togas and sandals, that's a problem. If we're thinking religion and we're only thinking about an Abrahamic tradition, that's a problem. If we're thinking science and we're only thinking of a white guy in glasses and a lab coat, that's a problem, not just in terms of racialization, but also in terms of gender. So I think all of these categories, we have to interrogate our taxonomic terms. And once we start doing that, then when we start to engage Indigenous literatures and Indigenous writings, we can locate them in a very different way. But I think it's also important to talk with Indigenous people in your community and with your colleagues who are doing a lot of this interrogation and critical engagement themselves. You don't have to do this on your own. You don't have to feel like you're by yourself. And if you are in a place where you feel isolated, go online, go to Twitter, go to Facebook, go to communities, reach out to folks who are doing really good work, and listen. I mean, one of the things that I often find is people reach out with questions, but oftentimes they've kind of presumed answers, or they get very defensive and nervous. Nobody's got it all figured out. We're all doing our best. Listen, go carefully, tread gently, and a lot of good things can emerge if you're open and humble in the approach.
All right, well, I think we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time today. Daniel, it's really been a pleasure and a wonderful presentation. I will just remind folks that we did record the session and that we'll distribute a link to it in the near future, probably within about 24 hours or so. And if you happen to see there in your chat box, folks out there in the audience, a link to a survey, please go take that and let us know what you thought of the presentation today and of how it was presented, all of that. We would really appreciate it. Thank you to all of you out there for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed and learned from the presentation as much as I did, and I hope the rest of your day is a very good one.
Thank you all so much.